as much as we can. And next. And before we take up national anthem, we'll open in prayer and open formalities. Thank you very much and welcome. And safety comes next after God. We're currently in Kasoni Hotels off Stadium Road. We are not aware of any drills, so that means if we hear, we'll respectfully go with the sound and mark it through the park. So whatever alarm we take it seriously, and we just walking slowly and fix. For ground rules, we could take to put our phones just so we are all distracted by any means. Have a focused house. And those online, we ask you and employ you to mute the mic when not speaking. You use the functionalities of the Teams, raise your hands, and on the chat box will always be running for you if you've got quick comments or questions, so you don't forget. Use the chat box for that. And if you're also at home, be on alert. You've got your own safety tips and measures, adhere to them. Don't leave your beans on the fire, please. Stay safe. Thank you. I'd like to invite our action lady, the section chairperson, the lady that leads all these men in the direction. And so far, so good. Ladies and gentlemen, if your hands are not busy, put the hands together for our section chairperson, engineer, Madam President. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Please ignore what he said. I'm just an ordinary Ngozi Okonkwo. So to start with, Happy New Year to everyone. I mean, this is the first having me. I'm good that it's one of us that it's going to speak to us. Like he's mentioned, the distinguished lectures are held like once every quarter. And you can imagine us how thrilled we are that the first one for the year, it's in Nigerian, in Nigerian, but someone that's second one to that's other. So thank you very much for being here. The topic for today is how oil and gas competencies are shaping low carbon energies. A lot of us here, especially in Nigeria, we are still more focused on oil and gas. And there's always this fear that now that the world is going, everybody is going towards cleaner energy and stuff like that. I know in the universities in Nigeria, we've not even started having courses on green energy, that we are still focused on local, our normal oil and gas that gives us the money as of today. And so we are worried about these things that we are learning. How are we going to I mean, in the next 5, 10 years, will it still be relevant? And so it's a topic that will be very important for us to listen to, because we're going to hear today that those skills that we have right now that we are acquiring for students, that it will still be very, very relevant in the near future. And so without much ado, I'd like to welcome, okay, back to CIC to continue with the introduction, but stay tax and listen to Okarafo.
Thank you very much. A few recognition here as the harassment for him. Thank you and welcome. We also see SD Dr. Joseph. I'll leave it there again. Dr. Joe, I'd like you to come to the high table. Welcome. And also, session chair, please come to the high table. And as I also see Pedro just made this way. Okay. You can imagine such a topic. Okay. You can imagine such a topic. I'm not worthy to moderate it. So it has to be from someone reclined. I'm someone that has dwelled in. He is an associate. An associate moderating an associate. He's an associate of petroleum engineering and petroleum and gas engineering, sorry. It's department of gas engineering. He's currently director of the Institute of Petroleum Studies, IBS, in very important. Hold a Bachelor of Engineering and Masters of Engineering from the University of Masters of Science and from Islam United Kingdom. He has already lead loading in gas and has authored of books and over 60 technical conferences. He had served in different parties, national and he's currently section director of Society of a member of SP International and the award tested back on SP Nigeria and Council. Has several notable awards and achieve Achieve Award for Engineering Faculty 21. Luton 2020. Dr. Joseph is of Nigeria. Dr.
here, and you can even be much more than just being a distinguished lecturer. So just see it as, that the sky is not your limit. You can just, go as far as you can. I'm standing on the shoulders of several giants. Many of them are not here. Many of them have been professors. You may have heard names like Chi Koku, Isaac Walker, Lawrence Osakwe. There are so many people that have inspired me, encouraged me, and taken me to where I am today. I would especially like to recognize Erasmus Nana, who believed in me. When we were at the Institute of Petroleum Studies, we were going through JPTs. He loves JPTs. And he just said, there was this column by Yves Spront, SP president. And he said, do you know that one day you can be the SP president? And, that puts into somebody the ability to aspire, to even want to do much more than, just. So thank you, Erasmus. Whether or not I become SP president, is at least you help me to aspire and do much more than I'm doing. Okay, so let's go into the reason why I'm here. First of all, I want to recognize SP Foundation. They actually funded this trip, making me available to be here. And this is through member donations. Also, a contribution comes from offshore Europe. I also want to acknowledge my company, Texas A&M, that gave me the opportunity to come here to give this talk. Made everything possible. My class that I'm supposed to teach, somebody is helping me teach it while I'm here. And also additional support is provided by the AIME. My topic is on how oil and gas competencies are shaping the low carbon energy technologies. And the reason why I'm talking about this particular topic is when I left to do my PhD, something needs to be on mute. I'm having an echo. Okay. All right. So when I left to do my PhD, I was a petroleum engineer, 13 years of experience, 2 years of, pre-experience, giving 15 years cumulative. And I was tasked with working with the geothermal team. And I said, how am I going to start? Because I know nothing about geothermal energy. But when I started doing my research, I found out that the skills I had as a petroleum engineer were the skills I used in my geothermal energy research. And I'm proud that out of all of us, the cohorts for the year that I joined 2017, I was the first person to graduate. And they were asking, how can a woman with 4 children graduate before ordinary students? And it was because of the edge I had because of the skills as a petroleum engineer. And soon after that, I was moved to a team that looks at CO2 storage and hydrogen storage. And when I started, I was very scared because I'm now an expert in geothermal energy with 0 on CO2 and hydrogen storage. But my research, I said that, and I was now teaching members of the team. And the edge I had was, again, the skill I had as a petroleum engineer. So I'm back here to say that if you have any knowledge as a petroleum engineer and you're thinking about the transition, as an engineer, first of all, fit into anywhere. But as a petroleum engineer, you will fit into things like geothermal energy, storage, underground energy, anywhere, even batteries, like so you will fit anywhere, have no fear. In the course of my presentation, I will give an introduction and I will go through 3 case studies. I'll be talking about different skills that were used to address these case studies. CO2 storage, underground hydrogen storage, geothermal energy, and then I'll come to a conclusion. So as a form of introduction, I would like to share this slide. Many of you would have seen the figures if you're looking at projections or where with terms of energy. So what we see on the left side is 2050, we would expect growth in renewable energy primarily. We would expect to see other renewables growing, natural gas is true, and also hydrogen. And so we need to think about where are the skills, where are the people that are going to be filling the roles to enable us provide that amount of energy. So we need people to do that. On the right, you're just looking at percentages, and you can see how things like natural gas is increasing in percentage, renewables, wind and solar are increasing over this time. So again, if we are going to have people looking at those things, the other going into decarbonization strategies. The oil and gas industry has been really flogged for being an industry that is not low carbon, but they've been making some efforts. And some of the strategies include energy efficiency and conversion, where we think of how can we optimize our plants to reduce emissions, how can we reduce the amount of electricity we're using in order to reduce the usage of electricity and hence emissions. We also think about working towards methane, because methane is a greenhouse gas that even in small quantities has a lot of impact. So we return from natural gas fugitives, venting and flaring. But the key area that I would like to focus on is what we call low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and power switching in the form of geothermal energy. So with low carbon hydrogen, there are two main types. The first one I'll talk about is blue hydrogen. So today, about 90% of the hydrogen that is produced for industrial use and other, all other uses come from natural gas. And this natural gas is converted through the chemical process to release CO2 and hydrogen. So we have a lot of CO2 being released as a result of generating hydrogen, which is a clean gas, okay? Now, if we leave this CO2 to keep going into the atmosphere, we have gray hydrogen. But when we capture that CO2 and we decide to utilize it or store it, it means we are not emitting that CO2 into the environment. And so we have blue hydrogen, okay? The second one is green hydrogen. If we take water and split it into hydrogen and oxygen through the process of electrolysis, we do not generate any CO2. And so this process is a low carbon process. It gives us the green hydrogen. So those two are the low carbon hydrogen sources. CO2 storage is basically capturing CO2 from different sources. It could be power plants, it could be the hydrogen production process itself. We capture that CO2 and find locations, especially in the subsurface, to store the CO2. We could also utilize the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. We can use it in several industries. The third one is power switching, and there are different ways in which we do power switching. For instance, this building may be powered with a generator, a diesel generator, and this diesel will be producing CO2 when we run it. Now, we could decide we want to use wind or solar energy or geothermal energy, depending on which kind of energy resource is closer to us. So geothermal energy is one of them, which is heat from the subsurface. I'll talk about it when I'm in my case study, but these are all ways in which we could switch power, okay, and decarbonize. The other thing I want to highlight is that me and a couple of people, including Mr. Okora for here, we did a competency assessment. We looked at energy technologies. Then we tried to different skills how the geoscience, engineering, TC, and we tried to how close this thing are related, but those by how much is it related to something. For instance, if we look at CO2, the geoscience skill will have about 3, formation evaluation about 2. This one should be reservoir engineering about 3. So it's range from 0 to 3, okay? So 3 is the maximum. And by the time we put all of this together, we find out here to store air, we can store this, can even store the surface, and geothermal has a high degree of similarity in skills that are used in the oil and gas industry. More importantly, we can see how very close high geothermal energy is, okay? In addition to that, we need digital skills. We are moving into a world where everything is being made autonomous. So if you have those, you can find it in any part of it. And then the non-core oil and those other operating functions, the legal, the economics, they're also very relevant and transferable. You just need to understand what kind of am I dealing with. So let me go to the case studies. The first case study is on CO2 storage. Now, if we want to store CO2 in space after we've captured it, I'm going to talk only about the value chain for storing in the subsurface. But if we have to look at what happens, you have to capture first, pipe it, transport it before you store, okay? But I'm focusing only on the storage part. To be able to do CO2 storage, you need to identify which kind of sites can I put CO2 into the subsurface, porous medium. And so you go through what we call a site screening. In your site screening, you want to know, do I have enough capacity? That is, do I have enough space to put my CO2 in the subsurface? Then you need to ask yourself, do I have enough injectivity to be able to push that CO2 into the ground? And so on and so forth. We then go into when we have identified that, yes, we have the space, we can inject, we're not going to be, creating fractures. We then go into another stage where we say, are there existing faults? And this is important for us because if there's an existing fault, when we put the CO2 inside, the CO2 is going to have a pathway to escape. And we don't want that. We want the CO2 to be kept in the subsurface. We also have to understand, do we have existing wells and what are their conditions? Because we will start with depleted fields because we know the properties of depleted fields. But when we inject the CO2, if we have a lot of wells, these wells are like pathways for that CO2 to leak, and I'm going to explain it. You can see that it's highlighted in bold, and then we think about other economic and environmental considerations. Once you are sure of your site, you then go ahead to get your permit to inject the CO2. With that permit, you are able to drill your well and start your injection process. When you inject, you need to know where your CO2 is going. And so we have CO2 monitoring. The CO2 in the subsurface or the plume. So we do CO2 plume monitoring. We want to know what's the extent, where is it going to? Is it going to somebody else's compound? Is it going upwards? Okay. So in this particular case study I want to focus on, I was part of a project where we were trying to see when we generate hydrogen from the steam methane reforming process and we get CO2, can we store that CO2? We found that the amount of CO2 that will be generated is so much. So we need to know, can we store it and where? And to understand where we can store it, we had to look at what is the risk of that CO2 going to leak out. And one of the ways in which that CO2 can leak out is through existing wells. So we want to understand in those regions that I want to store CO2, what is the impact of the existing wells? And so we do what we call a stage 1 site screening. What we do in that stage is we need to identify any reservoir that should not store CO2, and we have criteria for that, and I will explain. And then once we've screened out those ones, let's say out of a large number, we've reduced it to a smaller number, then we can now start getting more detailed data about those sites to understand what's going on. Once we've gathered the data, we now rank those sites based on several criteria, which I'll also show. And then the final deliverable will be for all those fields, we would rank them whether it's good, average, or poor based on the quality of the wells. Some of the kind of criteria we use for screening are listed here. One key one for us to note is the depth of the formation. So there it's 800 meters, about 2,700 feet. And the reason why we want to go deeper than that depth is because CO2 beyond that depth is what we call, it becomes dense. It's in the gaseous phase before, but once we get to that depth, it becomes supercritical. In the supercritical phase, it's mobile, it has low viscosity, but is dense towards liquid. And because of that, we can inject it into the reservoir and it's not going to move up as gas. It won't be very buoyant. So we can contain it. It also contains smaller volume. So that's a very critical factor. I wouldn't go through all the different factors here. The slides are available if you want to go through it. And I can explain if you're interested in the details. So the case study, we had 53 fields, of which 99% of them were gas. The other ones were underground gas storage sites. Many of them were depleted, and we applied that stage 1 screening as was shown. We After applying it, we came out with 27 fields that passed the stage 1. And so it's this stage 1 that went into further evaluation. To do the stage 2 ranking, we had to look at several factors. And those factors include things about rating them for the capacity, for the injection, if we can inject. We then look for retention and geomechanics risks. So retention, we want to retain the CO2 in the subsurface, and we do not want to inject to create any additional stresses or faults that will allow that CO2 to leak. For us to look at the retention and geomechanical risk, I list all the things we would rank, but here I just want to focus on the well quality, okay? Which is what I'll be talking about. So this slide shows an example of what will happen, why wells are quite important. So if you inject your CO2 into this well, into a reservoir, and you have a well that is perhaps corroded, or you have a well that the cement behind the casing is not good, or you have an abandoned well that wasn't properly abandoned, and there's still chances that fluid could move through, especially a gas, then you have a leakage point and the CO2 gets back to the subsurface. In trying to get permits in the US to be able to inject CO2, you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that none of your CO2 is going to escape through all of these wells. So if you have a field with 100 existing wells, you're going to evaluate all those 100 wells and show that CO2 cannot escape from it. Now, to evaluate these wells, 4 metrics were used. One is the age of the well. The second is well density. Third is well abandonment procedure. And the fourth is the well integrity. So the age of the well means, the older the well, the higher the chance that there could be corrosion, or it could just be, there could be some problems with that well. In terms of well density, you're looking at a given size and the number of wells. So the larger the number of wells in a given area, the higher your chance of CO2 leakage. Then when you begin to think about the abandonment procedure, many years ago, 100 years ago, they may not have been very strict abandonment procedures, or maybe some of the cements may have, something may have happened. So we look at what were the procedures for abandonment. Then we also look at well integrity. We look at what was the condition of the cement behind casing when we abandoned the well, or even when the well was in production. So using those 4 metrics, we developed some sort of table where we put for each of these fields, we showed what is the ranking based on the quality of the well. And then we take a total, we will rank them based on which one is good, which one is poor, which one is average. And then we present them on this map. So looking at this, the ones in green, I can say that those ones, you can store your CO2, you would have very low risk of CO2 leakage. And the ones in red, if you store your CO2 today, you have high risk of CO2 leakage. So what were the skills that were used to do this study? It was a combination of geoscience skills, formation evaluation, petrophysical skills, drilling, and well completion skills. Now, in a full CO2 assessment project, storage project, you will be using all these skills that are here, but just looking at the wells, these were the ones that came into play, okay? The second case study has to do with underground hydrogen storage. Now, for us to generate hydrogen, there are different ways. We need a source. Most of the sources we get renewable energy, nuclear, fossil fuel, bioenergy. And like I earlier mentioned, about 90% of the hydrogen we get today is from fossil fuel, natural gas. Then you go through a conversion process. So we have the steam methane reforming, SMR. We have autothermal reforming, ATR, and we have electrolysis. So these are methods that are well proven for generating hydrogen. There are other methods being researched on, of course, because we are looking towards a hydrogen economy. People want to think of other ways. And then you now think of how you're going to store the hydrogen if you have excess. So there are chemical methods of storing hydrogen. There are mechanical methods using tanks, using temperatures, but large-scale hydrogen is being stored underground. So if you read about hydrogen storage, you hear about salt caverns. So these are salt bodies that they drill into, inject water, the water kind of subsurface. Once we created that cavity, we inject the hydrogen inside and we're able to keep it. Now, there's a challenge with hydrogen storage in salt caverns. First of all, we do not have caverns all around. In this Nigeria, I'm not sure we even have up to one salt cavern to store anything. Secondly, the size that you can actually leach to get space for hydrogen is limited. So it's not a very suitable storage site for very large scale hydrogen. But we have porous media almost everywhere. I mean, in Niger Delta, if we just take one field, it will be able to store the amount of hydrogen that 3 salt caverns can actually store. And we have the benefit of pressure that is provided by the reservoir. As you grow deeper, you have more pressure that will compress the hydrogen. And then you deliver through pipeline tanks, and you have different uses of hydrogen. So a customer or a client met my research group, and they said they wanted to store hydrogen in the subsurface, and they had different fields that we should come up with which of their fields would be best to store the hydrogen. And when I looked at their fields, I realized that there was not in existence any method for us to select sites for hydrogen storage in porous medium. It didn't exist. People said you can use the criteria for CO2 storage or for gas storage. What I said before I do that, I need to find out if the same criteria I can use for CO2, I can use for hydrogen, because the CO2 criteria is in existence. So in order to do this, I and my group, we did use the numerical simulation approach. We had to mimic, if we are going to inject hydrogen into a kind of reservoir, we were going to consider the productivity index, the compression energy, well performance, and the recovery. So the productivity index is the flow rate divided by the delta P, the pressure drop or energy we're going to use to produce it. So it's important for us to find out that's Q over delta P, because it's going to tell us that you do not need so much energy to produce your hydrogen. Remember, with hydrogen storage, it's different from CO2 storage. With hydrogen storage, we want to get that hydrogen out to use it some other time. With CO2, we want to keep the CO2 in the ground. Compression energy. So it's very light, low viscous. You want to get that hydrogen in very large quantities into the subsurface. You're going to compress that hydrogen. So we need to think about what amount of energy am I going to use to compress my hydrogen to move it down into the reservoir. We also have to think about the well performance. When we begin to produce that hydrogen, how is it going to behave in the well? It may come with other fluids, methane, water, etc. So how is it going to behave? And then the recovery is, if I injected 1,000 barrels equivalent of hydrogen into the subsurface, how much am I going to get out? And so we want to maximize our hydrogen recovery. In order to do that, we use that base simulation model, and we did some sensitivity analysis on different depths, different permeabilities, different porosities, different parameters to see which one is going to maximize our productivity index, okay? And recovery as well. And so this figure on the left is a tornado plot. Anything in blue means we had a base case, but we reduced the value of the base case. And anything in orange means we increase the value of the base case. Anything towards the right of this line means it's giving us higher productivity index. And anything towards the left is giving us lower productivity index. And we can see clearly that when we look at the top of the reservoir, if we reduce our depth of our reservoir, we're getting higher productivity index. If we increase our formation depth, we also increase our productivity index and permeability as well. And so why the top of the reservoir? If you have hydrogen at a shallow depth, it's easier for us to not only compress, but also to bring it out. If it's very deep, we need to compress the hydrogen to meet the pressure downhole. And then when it's time for it to produce, because we have the effect of pressure, it actually traps some of the hydrogen in the subsurface. We cannot produce all of it out. On the right was looking at what we call the flow capacity, which is it is the permeability multiplied by the thickness, because you cannot just make a decision based on only permeability or only thickness. But when you put them together, you begin to see how that productivity index is going to change. And what we see is that in the case of depleted field, we actually have an optimal range for productivity index to maximize our recovery. Based on all those analyses, we then developed the site selection criteria. I cannot list all of them here, but they are here. But the most interesting thing we found out was that the criteria for storing hydrogen was very different from the criteria for storing CO2. So with CO2, we want very high pressure. We want it as deep as possible. It needs to be below 800 meters or 2,700 feet. For hydrogen, we want it as shallow as possible. We want dipping reservoirs. We want dipping reservoirs so that we can actually inject it out. You know, so many other things. So that was the first thing. And then after that, we then applied it on several case studies. These are the same fields that we used to study the CO2 storage, and we're able to demonstrate that the ones that were green were different from the ones that were green for CO2 storage, okay? And so this is where we applied it. So what skills came into play in developing the site selection criteria? A lot of geoscience skills came in. We brought in some well completion skills. Reservoir engineering skills were very relevant, well production, and combining surface facilities because we need to know how the hydrogen is going to behave when it gets to the surface. So the last case study looks at geothermal energy. And here I'm going to take you into what we do, you know, moving from lab scale studies to field scale studies. Now, if we look at the geothermal resource development chain, we go through exploration, appraisal, development, production, rejuvenation before abandonment. And you can see how very similar it is to the kind of process we follow in the oil and gas industry. That also explains why when we were looking at that competency map, the geothermal part had most of the, you know, higher relationship between the skills in the oil and gas industry. Okay. Now, geothermal energy is basically getting the heat that is stored in the subsurface. So we would have a reservoir, but now this reservoir is not oil and gas, it's containing water. This water is very hot. When we produce this water, as the pressure is dropping, it may turn into steam, or it may still remain as water when it comes up, but the temperature is usually very hot. This hot water or steam is then passed through a steam turbine. So the hot water will pass through what we call a flash. That flash will generate steam, and then the steam goes to the steam turbine. But if the reservoir produces steam, it goes directly to a steam turbine. We use that to generate electricity. If the temperature is not very high, we do what we call direct use, because we need very high temperatures to generate electricity. So instead, it can be used for things like heating of homes. It can be used for bathing. I mean, if you go to Iceland, they use a lot of geothermal energy for direct use. Now, you would notice that it's not everywhere that has geothermal energy applications. And that's because traditional or conventional geothermal energy is associated with volcanic regions. But people are beginning to think that, you know, as long as you go deep into the subsurface, your temperature is going to be increasing anyways. So can we harness the heat from beneath the earth to generate either power or do our direct use? And so that's when people came out with the concept of enhanced geothermal systems. So this is a system where we have rocks that are very hot, but they don't have porosity, permeability, and fluids. So remember, our typical reservoirs will have the fluid, it will have permeability for it to flow, and it needs space to contain it. So this enhanced geothermal system doesn't have that. It only has heat. So what we do is we go into those reservoirs, we inject water. The water can then create fractures or move fractures. We then circulate the water. When the water comes in touch with the hot rock, the water becomes heated up, and then we can extract heated water, okay? Just to show you what this looks like on a diagram, you would have maybe a pre-existing fracture. You inject your cold water, it comes in contact with this hot rock in red, and then when it's coming out, it comes out hot, and it's used for electricity generation or direct use. Now, in the subsurface, when we create maybe fractures or slip fractures, so to slip a fracture means a fracture existed, but it was closed. But when you inject the water tends to move the fracture in some way. And then you begin to have what we call a self-prop fracture, where you have spaces in between that allows fluid to flow through. What we have understood in these enhanced geothermal systems are the main flow is through those spaces in the fractures and faults. We inject our cold working fluid and we get hot working fluid out. We enhance our fractures through hydro shearing, which is that slippage of the fractures, and they tend to be self-propped. So they keep these openings open for fluid to flow continuously. Now, a couple of people began to study outcrops or even cores to see how these fractures behave. And at different scales, what they found out was that depending on the direction of how you slipped your fracture. So if this was your fracture close together, if you slipped it in this direction had a different roughness than this direction, okay? So you had two different kind of roughnesses in the direction. But what does roughness do? If you have a fracture that is smooth, like this table here, and you begin to inject water, it's going to move from injection point to production point, and it will just go in a very smooth circular pattern. But if you have roughness in your fractures, you're going to have what we call channeling. And channeling reduces the contact area between the water and the rock. And in geothermal systems, we're interested in the heat. How much heat can we get? So if we reduce our contact area, it means we have reduced our ability to extract heat. And so the question becomes, if we have fracture roughness, this fracture roughness is different in different directions. So this H here, I don't know if it's clear for all of you. So this is 0.6 and 0.8. The H in 0.6 is when you try to flow parallel to how you slip the fracture, while the H of 0.8 is if you try to flow parallel to perpendicular to how you slip the fracture. And so if we have different kind of roughnesses, how would they behave if we begin to inject either in the perpendicular direction or in the parallel direction? So to do that, we had to start from the lab scale. We had to see what kind of roughness do we get on the lab scale from cores that are typical of what we use for enhanced geothermal system. We measure the fracture roughness, or what we call the aperture. So what is the opening when we create that slip? And what we have here in light yellow, light blue are the areas of higher aperture, while the dark blue areas are very low aperture, okay? To be able to model this kind of behavior, reservoir engineers know that you need permeability. So you have to convert that aperture into a permeability, but there are known transforms. This is called the cubic law, where we take that aperture, divide it by 12, and get the we get the permeability, and we do a local one. So you split this into very, very small spaces, grids, and then you take what is the permeability for each of those small spaces. So this is what the flow configurations look like. Physically, if you slipped your fracture in this direction and you're producing from injector to producer here is parallel, but if you slipped your fracture in this direction, what you're producing this way is perpendicular flow. So it was important for us to see what's the impact of those flow configurations. The other thing we also needed to do is you can study everything on the lab scale, but it may not translate to what happens in the field. So we had to do what we call upscaling to see what happens on the field. And so to do that, we generated, using geostatistical techniques, several different kinds of aperture distributions. But before using those aperture distributions, we had to check, is it going to behave like what we see in reality? Because in reality, people have measured it. We know that our H in the parallel direction is within here, and the H in the perpendicular direction has this range. So if we check all those aperture distributions that we generated, we need to know if they would actually fit. Now, if they passed this test, we will use it for our modeling. If it did not pass, we will reject it, okay? So after that was done, we then went and built a numerical model for geothermal systems. Very important things. You need your temperature, you need your thermophysical properties, thermal conductivity, specific heat capacity to understand what was going on. And when we ran it through over 100 and something simulations, what we noticed was that 70% of those aperture distributions that were generated favored the perpendicular direction. What it means is that the temperature drop in the perpendicular direction was less than the temperature drop in the parallel direction. Now, with oil and gas, we think about pressure drop, but in geothermal, we think about temperature drop. So that's how we think about it. And then why was the perpendicular direction giving us better what we call thermal performance? It was because that one that had the roughness of H of 0.8 was very tortuous. So this is the flow part of the fluid. And as the fluid was flowing, it was like kind of meandering. And in meandering, it's spending a lot of time with the rock. So it was extracting more heat. But the one that is in the parallel direction, the fluid will just flow through in a very straight line. It doesn't have enough residence time, and so it doesn't extract much heat from the rock. And so with that, we then begin to think of well placement strategies for enhanced geothermal systems. We also looked at different fracture configurations, well configurations, and we see that in all the cases, everything that is red represents perpendicular direction, be it single wells, be it horizontal wells, be it horizontal fracture or vertical fracture. They were all better than their counterparts in blue, which is the parallel flow direction. So what were the skills that went in? There was a lot of geoscience, formation evaluation, rock mechanics, and reservoir engineering. But then again, as we have seen the whole resource development process for geothermal energy, all skills come into play. In fact, specifically for geothermal energy right now, you know that they are trying to reduce the cost of drilling because we know we drill into very hot zones. So they are thinking of what are the ways we can actually reduce drilling costs in geothermal systems. That is going to be a breakthrough area coming in the future. So to conclude on my presentation, I would first of all like to point a lot of people to two things. First of all, the kind of resources that exist within SPE to be able to help you upskill and reskill, they exist. Energy Stream, distinguished lectures, conferences, workshop, e-mentoring, technical sessions, and SPE journal. Peras Nana can tell us how much he has learned from there. But at the same time, people need to upskill, and there are different ways to upskill. And this plot shows the time commitment, shows the cost, and the different methods, while the size of the bubbles talks about how much knowledge you would eventually gain. And so if you look at where you are and you say, okay, I just need a little information to just have a basic understanding, you're fine to remain somewhere within here and here. It's cheap and little time commitment. But when you want to go into very detailed things, you want to go into understanding, is there reaction between CO2 and the rock, or things like that, then you want to start going into things like certificate programs and even advanced degrees, which involve more time commitment and more cost, okay? So to conclude, many petroleum engineering and geoscience skills are transferable to areas like geothermal energy, CCUS, energy storage, we've looked at all of them on that competency map. But we see that the core oil and gas skills are very linked to geothermal energy, carbon dioxide storage, and underground energy storage. There are several ways to upskill and reskill to bring out the value of oil and gas skills for low carbon energy technologies. And I can tell you that if they really want to advance the energy mix, they actually need the oil and gas people because they have all the skills, the expertise, the know-how to be able to advance those areas. So on that note, I would just say thank you all very much for listening to my talk. I look forward to your feedback, your questions, and please take out time to rate me as a DL because, they need to know that the money they spent, whether it was good or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause once again. Thank you very much, Dr. Rita. You've done a very great job here, and we really appreciate. let me just take a summary of what you've done before I take the questions. Basically, what she has presented shows that petroleum and geoscience skills are transferable. That is the bottom line of the story. And so she showcased different projections of various energy sources, 50 years target where we are heading to, because everybody is talking about low carbon energy sources. And she also showcased different decarbonization strategies. She talked about blue and green hydrogen and sources of low carbon hydrogen as well. She showcased different low carbon energy sources and identified core and not core oil and gas skills that are transferable. And she looked at basically the three different ways of storing low carbon energies, like the CO2 storage value chain. And she mentioned that it requires identifying the sites, screening and selection, capacity, injection, fractures, and so on. She also talked about CO2 permitting, drilling, and injection. And basically, she also talked about the monitoring and surveillance, particularly when we're talking about leaks, because it's not just about storage, but if after storing, can that gas be contained? Won't it leak out, particularly in the presence of existing wells in the system? So, she showcased criteria for screening candidates for site storage, particularly for the CO2, and also illustrated some case studies. She particularly talked about factors that contribute to leakages, particularly the age of wells, well density, well integrity evaluation, and well abandonment procedures. All these are things that must be checked before we can consider a site to be suitable for storing CO2. She went ahead to discuss underground hydrogen storage, and she illustrated the numerical simulation approach that was used. She talked about productivity index, compression energy, and well performance, and hydrogen recovery, and also criteria for storing CO2. That's an emphasis she makes, that the criteria for storing CO2 is actually different from storing hydrogen underground. She went ahead to talk about the geothermal energy and the various skills that are required to extract geothermal energy, exploration, appraisal, development, production, and rejuvenation. All these are attributable similar skills to the extraction of oil and gas in which we are already practicing. Very similar to our own way of extracting oil and gas. And she talked about how steam can be channeled to steam turbines as well to generate geothermal energy. Talked about more so emphasis was made on enhanced geothermal systems, where, because she mentioned that when we talk about geothermal energy, it's usually attributed to where you have volcanoes and so on. But what if, because with the deeper you go, the higher the temperature. So why can't we harness that that approach to actually extract the geothermal energy? So she also gave very good light on how to extract geothermal energy through very deep reservoirs or to rocks. And but she mentioned that such systems that have such very high temperatures have very low permeability and porosity. So the only way to actually extract this is through fracturing. And she told us about the consequences as well of fracturing and how to get the best from different fracturing operations. Thank you very much, Rita, once again for Universities. So now I can take questions from the audience. Anyone that had a question, please kindly raise your
Okay,
hand.
I would like to take count. So 1, 2, 3. Is that all? I've got a couple, so. Okay,
All
I'll
right,
take
1.
1. Sorry. One back first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, thanks. Just make it short, a quick intro of yourself and a question.
Good evening, everyone.
Okay, you just.
Yes, my name is Alphonsus Uche from Parasoso International. I want to know something. You know, your sources of CO2, you discussed was from the pipeline, turbine, and so. Let's talk about sources from atmosphere. Let's say you're using sources from the atmosphere, and now you're not storing in the subsurface. You want to store on the surface. How do you gather from the atmosphere, store on the surface, and measure it?
Okay, so we have what we call DAC. It's called direct air capture. It's a technique that we use to collect CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, CO2 capture, I didn't focus on CO2 capture in my talk, but CO2 capture, it follows a process. We need to look at concentration of CO2 in our stream and amount. So the higher the concentration of CO2, and the larger the quantity of CO2, the cost is going to be reduced. Now, the percentage of CO2 in air is very small compared to the CO2 in things like power plants. So that is why DAC, direct air capture, is not as prominent as the other methods we are doing, because you will need high concentration. You have a system, you have a combination of nitrogen, oxygen, CO2. You have to separate that CO2 from the nitrogen and oxygen first before you can take that CO2 and store. So the method of doing that is called DAC, direct air capture.
Thank you. You've got quite a lot of interest in today's call.
So those quantities are usually small. You store them in things like tank, and then you ship them up to industries that, like coke industry, those bubbles you see is from CO2.
Right.
So they ship them up to companies that will use them directly or do things like enhanced oil recovery. The quantities are too small to start undertaking a subsurface storage project.
Thank you very much. It's quite an interesting topic, so I'm afraid you might keep it shorter because you have
Okay.
a lot of interest.
Okay.
Thanks.
My name is Patrick Ezinachi. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Ma, for the excellent presentation. So 2 questions I have. When you were talking about the hydrogen value chain, you made mention of renewable, SMR, ATR, and electrolysis. So my question is it particularly to be used for a type of hydrogen like green and yellow or blue hydrogen? Now, the second question is geothermal energy you talked about, using Africa as a case study. Where can we apply it? Is it applicable around here? Yes. So I have somewhere like Senegal that's extremely hot. Was this research based on African?
Okay, so for the first question, when you produce hydrogen from SMR or ATR, you're going to generate CO2 with it. It's called gray hydrogen. Gray, G-R-E-A-Y. So but those methods generate the hydrogen with CO2. When you capture that CO2 and you store it, you get blue hydrogen. Electrolysis, on the other hand, is just taking water and splitting it into H2 and O2. So there's no CO2 being generated, so it's green hydrogen. The second question has to do with geothermal energy. There are specific locations that have high geothermal gradients in Africa. I have not studied Senegal, but I know in Nigeria towards the north, we have high geothermal gradients. But irrespective of where you are in the world, the deeper you go, your temperature is going to increase. So if you can drill to 5,000 meters, 14,000 feet, you will meet a temperature of about 200 degrees C, and you can, generate geothermal energy. So it's just, are you able to get to that depth? That is the question.
If you can drill it.
Good evening. My name is Glory. I'm from Novatic Limited. So my question is, when you were speaking about hydrogen storage, CO2 storage, you said something about the hydrogen we needed to come back up again later.
Yes.
But the CO2, you never made mention of that. As a matter of fact, by insisting that we don't need it to come back up, you stated
Exactly.
that. Yeah, so is it safer to say disposal of carbon dioxide rather than storage? Because with storage, we need it back up again. That's the first question.
Okay.
Second question is, you said something about the CO2 storage. We need to bring that technology. We have to evaluate every well in the vicinity. So in doing that, and not just in developed countries, bringing that, like say, the Niger Delta, what is the economic standpoint? Do we get to discuss that?
Okay, so the first one, CO2 storage is used synonymously with CO2 sequestration. So the term sequestration means we want to keep it, it should not come down. But some people are fine to use the terminology CO2 storage. So they are used interchangeably. But it's in the context of my presentation, it means we want to keep that CO2 inside and it should not come out. But for hydrogen, we want it to come out. Now, the second question has to do with evaluation of wells. And what the study shows is if you use information that is available, such as your cement evaluation logs, your drilling and completions program, you count the number of wells you have in your field. With that information, you're able to get a qualitative assessment of what the quality of the wells would be. So you don't necessarily need to spend much if you have the money, if you have the data. Now, once you've identified those sites that, based on all the data you have, show promise for CO2 storage, you may want to go back in and maybe check a few wells to confirm what you did. And you need to also, just do what we call a third stage characterization of your site. But you're not going to spend it on all the sites. You have to do your stage 1 screening, stage 2 screening before you go to the third stage, when you have fewer fields, maybe just 4 or 5 that you want to go and do further analysis. Thank you.
Just an add-on, don't forget your caprock. Don't forget, most times you have to target those maximum flooding area to trap your CO2. If you miss that, then your reservoir is going to come up. You have a question.
So, Rita, thank you for this session. I think this is like an uncharted territory for a lot of us. So, and I'm even encouraged that the skills I have is irrelevant.
You're
when
very
this
important.
begins to dominate, and it's very encouraging that you've actually evolved over time. Rita was a petrophysical engineer actually in a slum issue, but look at the kind of Greek she has gotten. In case you don't know, she was my classmate. I can see Jeff there. Yes,
Yes, my people came.
Yeah, exactly.
My people came.
They follow you come. So it is really very encouraging sitting in this room and the opportunity that this puts. A lot of the question that was coming early on when we were talking this energy transition is people in the next speech session like this will say, well, are we still here? Right? So it's very clear that we are really still very much here. So I have just a very, what I consider a straightforward question. What kind of surveillance requirements do we need to put in place after the storage? But we've stored it. I'm not sure we'll walk away entirely. There has to be a way of looking after what we've stored. So what are those requirements? Secondly, and I hope you don't forget the first one, the H2 hydrogen gas that will go back to try to recover later. The reservoir, even if it is depleted, is not necessarily a void, right? There's still some material. Imagine a watered out reservoir somewhere here. That is water at least there with other contaminants, if the carbon remain there. So is this significant in terms of processing of this hydrogen when you bring it back so that it becomes pure again for use?
Okay. All right. So your first question, you said I should not forget, and now I'm forgetting it. Okay.
Surveillance.
So the main thing is, it's a requirement before you get a permit that you're going to show 30 years after that well is drilled, what you're going to do, your monitoring and surveillance. So there are different ones. We have this above surface monitoring, where we're going to check for anything that comes out. We have sensors to do that. We're also going to check for soil, using the soil property. We have the level at where the cap rock is, if there's any changes with the cap rock. So we monitor changes in pressure, temperature, and CO2. Then we have the reservoir level where we do reservoir saturation monitoring. We do numerical modeling. We also run well tests. We see the extent of where our plume is. So you need to do a suite of monitoring. You need to, before you get your permit, you need to explain all you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it. So that's what is done. And then on the second one, which was what that person again, on our hydrogen. Okay, so that is why we did that study. So the basis of that study was to identify how can we maximize our hydrogen. So if we have a deeping reservoir, for instance, as you saw, the second top ranking criteria was the deep, and you place your well on the top part of the deep, the water is going to stay below, and your hydrogen, very buoyant, gaseous, will move up, and so you recover much more. But if you keep it in a horizontal reservoir, as you're pulling up, you're going to get cooning, and whatever is inside there comes out with it. Now, second thing is the end use of the hydrogen. If you're going to use hydrogen for what we call fuel cell, you need pure hydrogen. You cannot afford to have any impurity. We do not use hydrogen from depleted fields for fuel cells. But if you're going to use it to pass through a gas turbine where you could have used natural gas, it's fine. You can get from a depleted field, the hydrogen combined with methane, you can use it on a gas turbine. Yeah, you just need to do the watering, knockout drum, all those things, and then you get your hydrogen.
Just one question I was going to ask you on that, because we don't fully have depleted reservoir. I got involved in a screening Delta. It's very difficult to find a depleted reservoir. That's
We have strong water drive here.
yeah, that you can defend with the regulators. That's what the companies could call it depleted, because the recovery is less than 40%. But then the smaller companies, that's what they are looking at.
It's marginal.
So it's a bit difficult to manage in that space. What sort of recovery factor did you consider that made them pass those criteria?
So for these gas fields that we used, it's pressure that we used to evaluate their level of depletion. They were very, very low pressure. So it was the pressure we used, not necessarily the quantities. Yeah.
Well done, doctor.
Thank
you for coming back home.
Thank
to
you.
visiting. Very much chasing coming back home. Yes. No, the husband is my boss. He's my boss at work, and be careful.
Coming and visiting means different.
Okay, so Doc, I have two questions. Some bit of process safety. So I know that hydrogen has a wide range of flammable concentration in air, and which when you look at the ignition energy, it's lower than gasoline or flammable, or than natural gas. So regarding storage, what are those barriers, process safety barriers? I know you had mentioned leaks we could trigger. So what are those barriers that you consider during part of your surveillance? And then the second question is, this is very basic. So for drilling of crude oil or natural gas, we know of typical process safety hazards like kick or blowout. In hydrogen storage or taken out, what are those process safety hazards?
So for the first one, just to put things in context for people that may not understand, hydrogen is odorless and colorless. So that means if it comes to the surface, we would not even know. And if it is burning, we don't see it. Okay. So so this is the advantage that subsurface storage has over surface storage, because when it's under depth, not going to be flammable, it's not combusting, etc. But when it comes to the surface, sensors that are being developed to be able to pick hydrogen at very low concentration. So that is a big area of research, just the sensors for hydrogen. And secondly, using thermal imaging to understand, to be able to monitor where hydrogen goes, because you won't see it with the naked eye. So once it becomes inflamed, we're able to image it, and then we see it. Then talking about drilling and all of that. So the drilling is the same way we would drill normal wells. It's now the injection consideration, because we're basically passing the hydrogen in, and then the production considerations into our wells. So hydrogen, the main challenge we see is embrittlement. That's what we see as an impact with our wells. And what we do now is material selection. We spend a lot of time choosing the kind of materials we are going to use for our casings, tin hydrogen. So that's really what we consider. Yeah.
Just coming, sorry, I've got a couple, so I'll be chipping mine. You mentioned that the depth, you used depth as a criteria, about 800 meters, 2,000-ish feet. Is there a pressure temperature component to that? Because this could vary based on basins. In the Delta, most of our reservoirs you could find around 153K, seismic-ish. And then we'll consider that HPHT, so that means you can't even drill it. So is there a pressure component to that depth?
Okay, so the supercritical pressure and temperature for CO2 is 71 bar. So that would be about 700 meters or so, and then 37 degrees C, which you also get at that depth. So that's why we put that 800 meters. So if you have a reservoir that is not depleted in pressure, 800 meters would give you the pressure and temperature you're looking for to get your CO2 supercritical. Now, when you have screened out your fields at 800 meters, you will now go back to the existing field that deeper than 800 meters to understand what pressure is. And if the pressure in the reservoir is below that 71 bar, then you also screen them out again. So that will come out in your stage 2.
Valuable information. Thank you. Do you consider saline aquifers?
Yes, we do consider saline aquifers, but they are not well characterized like the depleted oil and gas fields. So we know properties of oil and gas fields because we drilled into them. Saline aquifers we have not. So they are usually last resort if we don't have any other option.
Daniel, your hand is raised. Could you ask your question? Online, yes. Please go ahead. Hello.
Okay. Yeah, good evening, everyone. Please kindly confirm you can hear me.
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you very much, Ma, for the presentation. And I wanted asking that if you kindly brief the current state of how efficient the CCUS method is to curbing climate change, and also aside the CCUS method being capital intensive, can you kindly highlight other limitation areas considering using the CCUS method? And also, I was looking at underground storage of CO2 over a long period of time. Would there be any reaction over time which might also endanger lives on Earth? And yeah, that's just the question. I don't know if you get it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me talk about CO2 being the kind of recovery, okay? The kind of recovery with CO2 storage, if it's an efficient method and all of that. The amount of CO2 that is being generated is in gigatons in terms of mass. Now, if you want to store gigatons of CO2, in order to meet this drop in temperature that we are going towards, you do not have any surface facility that can store gigatons of CO2. People have thought about how about we plant trees everywhere. In order to get the trees that will extract all that CO2, there will be no space on land and sea for the CO2. Therefore, for large-scale CO2 storage, we take advantage of the subsurface because it has the pressure to take a very huge amount of CO2 and compress it and keep it in a much smaller volume for a longer time. Now, will there be reactions? We look forward to reactions in the subsurface because CO2 has to be trapped. There are different methods of trapping CO2. You have your seal that traps your CO2 to prevent it from going upwards. But if CO2 reacts with the rock, which we see mostly in carbonates, it converts to something else and that CO2 never comes out. But in sandstone reservoirs, the CO2 reaction rate is very low And so it will take millions of years before we can get what we call mineralization of CO2. So yes, CO2 does react. We hope that reactions will take place. And people are even thinking of how can we speed it up. In Iceland, there's a project where they're actually doing, advanced mineralization so that CO2 can easily be converted, react with the rock, and is kept in the subsurface.
Yeah, and it's been giving rise to things like elite, montorinonite, sort of clays that people now see during drilling. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks. Very nice presentation. My name is Eric. So in your selection criteria for site for maybe hydrogen storage or CO2 storage, do you consider tectonically active regions where, I mean,
yes,
they could be faulting over because of fracturing?
Yes, so it's a screening criteria. If you have a region where there has been any earthquake of any sort, you are not going to store CO2 there, because the moment you bring in that pressure, is going to reactivate those faults, is going to cause earthquake, and so you would not do that. So it's a screening criteria. Yeah.
Just to honor our chats, we had mentioned it's a couple from the chat say, awesome presentation, thank you. Do you think there is, that's coming from Debbie, do you think there is potential for modular gas to liquid technology in the oil and gas sector, especially towards monetizing flared gas or stranded gas assets and reducing methane emissions?
So this question is not directly related to anything that I have spoken about today.
But you have the competency.
But is there prospects for that? Of course, there is prospect for that. With the right technology and policies and regulations, we can always do it. Okay. Yeah.
I think the next question, Abdullahi, you've touched upon it on competencies needed. Last from me, where is the place of seismic in this? Whether regular conventional seismic or microseismic for fractures in geothermal?
Okay. So seismicity it cuts across CO2 storage, hydrogen storage, geothermal energy. So we do microseismicity monitoring to understand if there are small changes when we're injecting. And then we have the surface seismic that helps us to monitor where the plume is for CO2 and hydrogen.
Do you acquire seismic data?
Yes, you will have to acquire baseline seismic data before you inject. And then as you inject, you do again so that you know what has happened to your CO2.
Ladies and gentlemen, here you have it. I mean, see, when they say when you go to school, they say school has scam. School has scam. Come on. This is what we're talking about. Cutting across the entire petroleum engineering, entering into process safety, coming back again to commercialize it. Thank you very much, Dr. Rita, an associate professor. We do dearly appreciate this. And thank you. You've gifted us a lot. Some of those things on bars, on temperature, you will need to go to the lab to find it yourself. And then she's just giving it to you, you can say rule of thumb, 800 meters, I should be there. You are now sounding intelligent by coming to DL. Yeah, you never did the lab. But that's what you do. We put those values, rule of thumb. In the US, it has worked. Thank you very much. We'll continue the rest of the program. We're out of time, but this has been a very...
Please, let's go back to this code. It's very important that we rate her. It's priority for us. If you enjoyed her talk, please, let's go. We need to rate her. It's more important that the talk safe. So please go and rate her.
Simeon is going to post it on the groups. YP chairs, student chairs, please take it to your groups. Let's get her because this is one of the best. The WhatsApp group, it's on the groups now. Okay, please let's rate. I'm sure we are all excited about this. So rating should be easy. And don't be stingy with your rates. Don't think my lecturers don't give me 100. Why will I give 1? It's part of the scale. And don't think, there are some people naturally, they never, Dr. Joe, they look your color. There are some people that say, you must, whatever I write, I'll give you 70. What's wrong with so please be generous with your scale. The 100 scale is as important as the 0 scale. So use it. I use it when I'm excited, and I am this time. Thank you. So go to the rest of the program. Has presented. So this to 7, we also want us to leave on time. I think at this point would just a moment. Okay. So I'd like to invite the SC. Can always delegate. Please, over to you.
So at this time, I would like to invite, we have 2 SDs here, 3 SDs, a junior SD and senior SDs. So I'd like to invite the very senior SDs, SD Otman and SD Erasmus, to please carry out this
Okay.
job.
Good evening, all.
But you were able to do justice to it. And of course, you are equal to that. We'd like to appreciate you for simplifying the Greek and Latin to our own understanding. Thank you very much. On behalf of this section, we present this e-copy certification. The hard copy will be forwarded to you. Thank you, and thank you again and again.
Thank you. All the recipients of the night's certificate, you can join. Thank you. Yes, please. Beside every successful woman, there is a man. Okay, please, yes. It's an exciting evening. That's what happens. Urgency into your brain. You get excited and density, buoyancy, everything. This is the kind of deal we should have actually had a buffet dinner, to be honest. Let's see. I want to set you up. Indeed. Okay, we'll quickly on this.
Increasing awareness of the topic that we just listened to. We did the monthly industry week of the day. These are the winners of the quiz. Three of them here: Moyi Nelson, Tamu Ajeneka. Okay, Manasseh. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It's exceptional effort. Keep it up. And there's an example, everyone else here.
So do we have anybody who's an SP? No, in church now after the preaching gets of offering. Okay, so you can, for us at our members, you can see you can understand why you should be an SP member. We have opportunities like this to learn. I mean, we've not, a lot of us have not gone to US, but imagine talking to us that, I mean, you can start Nigeria and be a distinguished lecturer. Do you know what it is? A lady, distinguished lecturer, SPEI, not Nigeria or Africa. We not to learn. Please, don't keep this message to you. Take it back. You need to keep them in this. You don't sit back. Have to learn. We have to acquire skills, both soft, to continue growing. So that's the message.
SPE. 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 I think let's just go through some of the upcoming events. I mean, the value of SPE is undeniably enormous. Recently, I was trying to fill up my PMP recertification and they count PDU. I shared this testimony with a lot of people. And all I needed to do was just to put what I do in SP. And my PDU was maxed out. And that was all I need to recertify. So, because community service, education, is technical knowledge, you're getting short courses. You saw the graph you put in there. I saw our technical meeting, or you featured in that slide. Did you see that? Those bubbles, right? So imagine monthly, you probably would have gotten up small molecules like that. So you see, please take this thing serious. And it's a privilege. You're already a student getting this information. 22 years ago, she was in this space. So could you be the next person 22 years time or shorter? Or shorter. So let's see the rest of the program. There's an offshore, onshore safety course coming in. Come start today. Safety. So here to see that to be in that program, there's a lot to learn from them. And certificate to be should have got your license. Them over time. The investment, just one wrong Bitcoin you buy. Please, please, please use your money well. No matter how that listening a lot, you might think to real stuff no why okay, before we first, okay, let's do the closing prayer. We'll come for closing remark. Votes. Thank you.
SP